I just remembered that.
Maybe a few moments.
Yeah, it just came up here, Emily. Thought I should let you know.
Students with ADHD.
Yeah, my Wi-Fi is low. I'm going to mute it and I'll be right back. Everybody just say good morning. We're just waiting for people to come in.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah. We are now live.
Yeah, it just came up here, Emily.
So we're just waiting a few moments to have Emily join us back. We just have some technical difficulties, technical issues.
Hello, I'm competing with all of nearby school districts for my bandwidth right now. So definitely school is important, including my little remote learners. Shech Patchwai, everybody. Thank you for those of you that are joining us live as we're going to go into the show today.
Good to go.
So again, what's up?
I was just saying.
Okay. So again, we're War Cry Podcast, and our theme today is national advocacy and resources. We hear from tribal members a lot about wanting to know what's out there, who's out there. So our intent today is to learn about those resources available regarding missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, as well as insight on legislation and efforts from communities and tribes. Again, some of this information can be sensitive and triggering. So if you need to step away or make sure to have additional self-care, we definitely encourage that. So again, welcome to this episode of War Cry Podcast. We are in season 2. We are an all Native run podcast discussing data, events, stories, issues, and historical connections about Northwest's missing and murdered Natives. We are located on the Yakima Reservation. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We are live streaming during the noon hour Pacific time. My name is Emily Washings, and co-hosts today are Patsy Whitefoot, Robin Peebushy, and Lucy Smartlowit. Guests today are Paula Julian and Rose Lee Quilt from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center policy team. I'm going to actually turn it over to our guests to give an introduction of themselves. So take it away.
Oh, so excited to be here. Truly, Kwatlani, thank you. Shuk Pachwai, Inmi Naimuma, Wanik Shash Lashawat, or Rosemary Lee Quilt. Good day, everybody, my relatives. My Indian name is Lashawat. My English name is Rose Quilt. My mother is Tatwasa, or Jeanette Lee. Father is Dave Buzzard. My maternal grandparents were Mama Tacha, or Elizabeth George, and Martin Hannigan. My paternal grandparents, Frank and Mary Buzzard. We always called them Grandma and Grandpa Sully, because Sully is the Cherokee word for buzzard. So they were out of Oklahoma. And then I was culturally adopted by Bill and Della Cheney out of Kequan, Alaska. But again, good to be here, very honored to join you all. I'm zooming in from the traditional homelands of the Auction peoples in Arizona. But as a Yakima, my heart is back home with all of you. I refer to myself as a nomadic granny because I moved to Arizona to live and be near and support my 4 grandchildren who are growing way too fast and are now teenagers. So when they move, I will move. But currently I serve as the Director of Policy and Research with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I've been here now for 9 years. Wow. Everybody, where does the time go? And I'm thankful and standing with all our relatives today for the Day of Truth and Reconciliation, as I see many of you wearing orange as well. And Patsy just shared with us about, the boarding school experience and, that impact from back home in Yakima. So just again, joining prayers and offering unity for our young ancestors who did not survive, and along with their families. So thank you. Paula?
Thank you, Rose, and thank you to Emily and Patsy, Lucy, and Robin for hosting this podcast and inviting NIWRC to join. So my name's Paula Julian. I'm a senior policy specialist for NIWRC. I've been with NIWRC since we started in 2011. This year is today is our 10-year anniversary of serving as the National Indian Resource Center addressing domestic violence and the safety of Native women. So I forgot. I woke up this morning, and then it's actually perfect that you guys have this podcast for us because 10 years ago today, our small staff, I think there were not more than 5 or 6 of us, and then we've doubled and grown in size, opened our doors to begin to do this work. Many of us, like myself, have been working on violence against women and violence against Native women issues. I've been doing this work since 1996 with Indian tribes, and I've been doing this work since I was a young girl. So I'm Filipina, born and raised, first generation Filipina American, born and raised in San Francisco, California, and in the Haight-Ashbury district. So I grew up around all the hippies and the immigrants that were living in the Haight-Ashbury then, and ended up moving to DC in 1995, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, I'm Filipina. I live and work from home, which is the La Jolla Indian Reservation in San Diego County, California. It's the land of the Payam-Kawitcham, or the people of the West, where I now have my family. And I'm, again, just glad to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our guests. Again, National Indigenous Women's Resource Center has a large website with a number of information. I'm going to turn it to announcements. If we can load the slideshow. So we have an update on the cases that we announced. As you know, we announced missing people that were from the Yakima lands, as well as other people in the state of Washington with their families' request of us. Retha Mae Finkbonner was found alive. So again, that's an update to the Washington State Patrol's missing people list. Today, September 30th, is Orange Shirt Day. It's a day of awareness for boarding schools for the United States and residential schools in Canada. Those are placeholder titles and names. Obviously, there's a lot of different aspects and things that are connected with those, what they call schools, forced assimilation and violence. We do have and have been hearing from the family of Ncai Gabby Petito, and they did make a statement of support, a strong statement of support regarding increased media and search efforts for all families of the missing, including missing and murdered Indigenous women. Our co-host Patricia Whitefoot was interviewed for the Today Show. And we also have Little Swans at the fair. This photo was taken by a parent of the Little Swans, and you can see 2 children dressed in red wing dresses, along with Patricia Whitefoot in a red wing dress holding a drum with their arms up.
The Washington State Fair, just because I'm here in Yakima.
At the Central Washington State Fair, aka the old Saluskin Village. Patricia, do you want to give a little bit more explanation about this photo?
Sure, I will. Thank you. Of course, our Little Swan dancers, the Iksik were invited to perform. We performed on the park stage there, near where all the food is. And so this was the a debut for some of the girls, because this is the first time some of these young ladies were able to perform with us. And as many of you know, we practice with the young girls. We have our leads, Mary Jones and Elder Marlene White, myself, who work with the girls along with the parents and grandparents and fathers and mothers who work with our children. Basically, we're just sharing them some of those history, social dances, the songs, the drumming, about who we are as Yakima women. And so continue this tradition with our people as well. And having learned these songs when I was a child, it's important that our history and culture lives on in the lives of our children. So I want to thank our parent for sharing the photo with us today. Thank you, Emily.
Yes. And we also have the a note from the NIWRC policy team that if any point during this session you need culturally appropriate advocacy or support, please contact the Strong Hearts Native Helpline at 1-844-7-NATIVE. Again, that's 1-844-762-8483, or chat online at strongheartshelpline.org. I think that is a great lead in as well into our next announcement slide about National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Again, I'm going to turn it over to Patsy, because Patsy walks around with this at so many different presentations that she does, and everybody lines up like it's an ice cream truck. That's how popular this item is. Take it away, Patsy.
Thank you. And actually, I have the same magazine right here in front of me because I carry it with me in my laptop bag. So I also have a copy of this particular magazine. I just want to say, with regard to the Restoration magazine, for our audience, that this is a wonderful resource. This is about stories shared by tribal people throughout the country, throughout the United States, about the impact that missing and murdered Indigenous women issues have on our families. But our families are also speaking out through this magazine, and really want to thank the staff from the NIWRC, both Paula Julian and Rose Quilt, who are with us today, about their advocacy work that they do, and also the inclusion of listening to the stories and taking time to provide support, but also helping through Congress to make changes. And so it's because of this magazine, that really listens to the voice of the people, that the work that's being done and the advancements that are being made, particularly with the Violence Against Women's Act and other related kinds of legislation, is important. And so please sign up for the Restoration magazine. It is free from the Seattle Indian Health Board, which is providing this magazine to us. So you can go to the website, and there'll be a link in the website. There's a link somewhere there, and it'll say you can sign up for the magazine, but you could also download it as well. If you need any support, please feel free to just email us or text us and let us know that you need some support. So there's the download click that Robin is sharing as well. And on this particular page, there'll be a link to this magazine. So a wonderful resource and stories that are being shared. I'm still working on a story about war cry with our group. And I've also shared personal stories from myself as well as my family. And so if you want to be featured, please feel free to contact any one of us, and we'll work with the staff on your story. Thank you, Emily.
Yes, Patsy can only carry around so many magazines with her in her her tote. So please register and sign up to receive that great information, or go online and read it digitally. I want to turn over to some of the resources that we saw when we were just clicking around the website. In particular, one of the toolkits regarding missing people We at Yakima have over 20 missing Indigenous people. That's out of over 100 in Washington State. And what we're going to do here is we'll go round robin from Robin and then myself, Lucy, and Patsy, and ask you questions. So go take it away, Robin.
Round robin, starting with Robin. Let's see. I just want to thank you all for being here. I suppose what brought you to this organization in the first place? Like what had brought you there? Because I'm hearing you guys have longevity. That says a lot about any organization that has people that stay with them for such a long amount of time, meaning that like the work that you do seems to be very fulfilling. I suppose what is like the reason that you had got into the work? And then a follow-up would be, is there any particular project that is like near and dear to you that you've been a part of?
Okay, who's it? Rose? Okay, I guess I'll start. So again, thank you, Robin, for that question. When I think about how I got into this work and why I've been with NIWRC since the very beginning, it really speaks to the word responsibility and relations for me. In college, during college, I lost my mother and my partner at that time. This was in the early 90s. And I really lost my way. I finished college. I struggled and I finished college despite that. And after college, I just started to work for a women's shelter in San Francisco. And it was through working with the women and children in shelter, as well as working with the other advocates, that I was reminded that my life is not just my own, that it's related, I'm related. I have connections and I have responsibilities to women who have gone before me, women who are living today, and the women yet to be born. And I have carried that sense of responsibility and relations with me since then. So since 1994, and then I was recruited to help open the first Violence Against Women Grants Office in DC in 95. After the passage of the first Violence Against Women Act, I stayed in DC for 11 years, working with tribes for a majority of my time there. And then when I moved home here on the La Jolla Indian Reservation, I took a break to have a family. And a couple years after that, Tilly Black Bear called me, grandmother of our movement, and said, "Paula, you have your family now. It's time for you to come back and help your sisters." And, you know, responsibility and relationships. And when an elder asks you to step forward, you don't say no. And that's for real. And that's what's kept me with NIWRC and in this work for more than half my life. So, Rose?
Thank you, Paula. So I guess for me, I mean, as a Yakima woman, it's important for us to advocate about the importance, I think, of reclaiming our teachings, traditional teachings about our role as women. And like Paula said, with that responsibility, I mean, as a mom, as a grandma, the daughter of my mother and of Mama Tacha, my grandma. And before we started the podcast, we were talking about the longhouse and standing in that line. As I've, grew up in that line and just, learning from my elders, the elder women with the Wulptaikish, the songs that we'd sing for all the ceremonies that we do at the longhouse. So, just really standing on that strength. We have so much strength and resilience that I just, I think we're all in agreement that it's time. We're at that time, that moment in time to really honor the role of our women and our relatives. I think it's also an honor to be called to this work. It's a very sacred duty, and I know it's one that we all take to heart. I think in many ways, maybe I, along with so many others, that we were actually born into this work, and so we do carry that responsibility to take in that knowledge that we are handed to from our elders, from the grandmothers, our aunties who've shared with us, and it's our responsibility to pass on that knowledge that we've been gifted, and to pass that on as well. And I think where this all came from, I think from a very early age. I was shaped by my mom, my grandmother, those elders, and all of the issues I think that were impacting our people at the time. I remember sitting at, those dinners where we have, they're having long discussions about the importance of our traditional ways, foods, our songs, our treaty and water rights, and the long-standing battle with Senator Slade Gordon. We don't want to hear that name. But I remember growing upset as I heard, his attack on our tribal ways in our nation. And so I think at that early age, I noticed, I think I felt a flicker, a light, a spark, and I knew I wanted to serve our people. So, so by my teenage years, I set my sights on law school, which I eventually did with my 4 kids in tow. And upon graduating, I really had the intention of going back to Yakima and serving our people. But life had other plans. And as I've often heard, the work chooses us. So maybe I questioned it at the beginning, but I didn't resist it because I think it just made sense in terms of my own survival and healing from the early, violent experiences that I went through and grew up with, and even in my adult years and abusive relationships. So I just know, as an Indigenous woman, as a Yakima woman, I don't want to be another statistic or a number. I don't want that for our children and our grandchildren and the generations to come. So, so working with NIWRC, it was a natural alignment. And with this family and with all of you, a large family of advocates. And so I'm thankful. Thank you for that question, Robin.
Thank you. And I haven't heard that name in such a long time. My grandma used to call him Snake Gordon. So, so wow, that threw me back. Because I was younger, my grandmother was a Yakima woman, and she went to be a legal secretary. So she was really into law, and especially law and sovereignty by the Yakima Nation. So thank you for just reminding me about all of that.
And switching to, the work that you're doing there at the organization and some of the resources for our viewers that haven't heard about National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, haven't been to their conference, Women Are Sacred. I just want to give you a little bit of insight into what it feels like to step into this space. I believe my first conference was in Albuquerque, and I just saw a bunch of advocates and women and like tables full of resources and these big images of strength and resiliency and walking with your medicine. Like, they were blown up like over life size. And it just gave you a sense of like, there's so many people around the nation that are working on this. And so when you think about National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, you think about people that are able to gather both resources and people to connect to different things. And one of the things that I've wondered is, how do we connect these resources that you have available to the people that need them? There's about 1,000 different places I could have chosen to go with this, but I did really like a couple of items. I'll start with the missing person poster, which is a part of a toolkit. And it really, given the amount of people that we have missing on the Yakima Reservation, we're having to have missing persons flyers completed and done. And sometimes not all the information is on there. But this is downloadable through a PDF or a Word document. I tested it out myself yesterday to see if I could do that. We'll provide the link in our show notes, but it has date of birth, age, sex or gender, race, eyes, hair, height, weight, what they're wearing, and identifying characteristics, and then who they can contact for additional information. So being able to have a customizable 8 by 11 missing person flyer, a template for that to help with Native women that are missing, I think it's an important resource. And I just wonder if you have additional insight about, families having to, needing to take some of this information and having these resources.
Emily, that's such a, thank you for sharing that resource. We at NIWRC, in partnership with a group of family advisory group members, really started this past January in looking at a draft MMIW reference guide or toolkit. And Patricia is one of those members. And so thank you again for your incredible leadership. But Patricia, along with several of our other family members, along with our national partners, we have national partners that are also working with us on the toolkit. And that includes the National Congress of American Indians, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, the Indian Law Resource Center, Strong Hearts Native Helpline, and the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions. And Paula, if I forget somebody, please jump in. But in looking at the toolkit, we really wanted to make something accessible to families. Unfortunately, we don't like the fact that we have to develop this toolkit, but realize, that there is the crisis that's occurring, including in Yakima. And I know, and I have relatives who have, missing and or murdered relatives. And so Patricia has been, very vocal with us in our working group in, advising and making recommendations that this is something that when we develop it, that we also look to ways in bringing it to the communities so that we have sessions or, with the communities about the reference guide and what families need to do and have just available at their fingertips should a relative go missing. So that, I know that's one way. Emily, to your question about how do we bring this to our community, and that's through Patricia's suggestion in having sessions, coming together as, I don't know if it would be some community hall meetings that you gather to discuss the toolkit. So, and I don't know, Paula, if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Rose. I think as I was listening to Emily and listening to you, Rose, I can't help, and some of the viewers may also be thinking this, I can't help but just think, and I realized that Gabby Petito's family has, issued a statement of support for the War Cry podcast, but I really can't help but think about why do Native families need this toolkit? It's not that they want it. It's not that any of us want it. It's why do they need it? There's not a toolkit to help families of all races because all races don't experience missing and murders in the same way that Native women experience it. And then a step further, their families, all families also don't experience what Gabby Petito and her family experienced. So Indigenous families overwhelmingly are left to search for their missing and murdered loved ones. So the response that we saw with Gabby Petito, with law enforcement from 5 states working together to search and find her, thank goodness. We don't see that at all happen for Indigenous women and Indigenous persons. What we see is law enforcement repeatedly, no matter where they are in the country, systemically saying the same thing. Well, she's out partying. Oh, she'll be back. Discounting the concerns that family members are sharing. So how do we get this toolkit out? We get it out by word of mouth. We get it out through all of our networks. But more importantly, we get it out because Indigenous families need it, because the systems aren't there for Indigenous families. So sorry about that. I just got really upset just thinking about that.
I want to have a follow-up question to you about on that regard, since we're fifth gearing it into that. Let's go. Frequently around here, families don't get updates on their cases. This has been brought up in numerous conversations from myself and other members of this team. And one of the things that the FBI, who is often in charge of or has co-jurisdiction with their cases, is they do not comment to press or publicly about open cases. Yet in the instance you just brought up with Gabby Petito, we saw press conferences. Now, we know that the FBI has had press briefings in Spokane, and they've had press briefings in Seattle. They have not had a press briefing in the Yakima area for years. I would say almost a decade or longer. It hasn't been in recent times. And so I just wonder if you can comment or give insight about why that difference? Why is there a difference why do we get a different response as missing and murdered Indigenous people than other cases of from other ethnicities?
Rose?
That's a big question. And again, our blood, is rising, that our blood is boiling at this point in time. But, I think, and that's why I guess I look forward to our next restoration magazine that will be coming out, because we have an article in there about, the civil rights of, Indigenous families who are, facing this exact issue, in terms of lack of even a response, lack of investigation, lack of any sort of coordinated response in terms of a search or anything. The US DOJ has a responsibility to investigate, but there's a pattern, as you're talking about. It's a pattern and practice of inadequately responding to cases of MMIW based on, what we're saying is discrimination. It's discrimination against Native peoples. So, and Indigenous women who have been abused, trafficked, abducted, or murdered, those families have a legal right. We have to continue to light the fire under the government. They have a federal trust responsibility to Indian tribes, to families of those, families who have a missing relative or who have a murdered relative. So we just have to continue in the efforts that we're doing to raise this issue, and it's possibly a civil rights issue. So that discussion is will be starting, and like the conversations with the field that Lucy and I think some of you were able to join us with regarding MMIW and advocacy around MMIW. These conversations are something that we really need to have and continue to have in order to build a response, because it's overdue. Our families are hurting, and so but it's something that we need to continue to lock arms and just really raise up and address. Paula?
Yeah, thank you, Rose. And I would add, when, why the differential response? The differential response, you can trace back to the roots of the United States. The U.S. government and government services were never designed to look out for the health and welfare of Native peoples and Indigenous nations. And Native people know that. That's your lived experiences from before the formation, before 1776. You knew what protection by the U.S. meant, which is why, for example, some tribes that were fortunate enough to negotiate treaties included a clause called the Bad Men Clause in some of the treaties that said that where bad men, white men, commit acts of abuse and violence against Indians, that the U.S. agrees to be held responsible. We have one case from 2003. I think it was settled in 2009, but it was the Levita Elk case against the United States. I don't know if you folks know about it, but it's the only case we have where a tribe, a family, was able to hold the U.S. government at least accountable through civil remedies for violence committed against a young woman in their family. And they had to go that route because the feds decided not to prosecute, which we know all too well factually. The federal prosecution rates are the lowest for these cases. The greatest number of cases that the feds decline to prosecute are cases involving domestic and sexual violence, the majority of which are against Native women. And so when we think about the differential treatment, it stems back to the differential treatment of Indigenous nations from before the U.S. became a country. The taking of tribal lands, Native lands, from Hawaii to all across the United States to Alaska, was very much tied to making sure that Indigenous peoples were relocated, terminated, sent to boarding schools, assimilated, or attempted to be so. So it's all of those federal policies for which the U.S. has apologized for. They apologized in 98 to Native Hawaiians, in 2009 to American Indians, and most people don't know about these formal apologies that are U.S. law. But what people always say to me when we talk about these apologies is those apologies are meaningless because the U.S. government continues to fail in carrying out their legal and moral trust responsibility. So it's a huge answer, but it really stems back to understanding the violence against Indigenous women is very much tied to violence against Indigenous nations. I woke up one morning, I was in New York to speak with some Native sisters on a panel on missing and murdered Indigenous women at a United Nations event. And I woke up and I was like, I have these moments and I'm like, oh my God, I should know this. I've been doing this for more than 20 years. MMIW is MMIN. It's missing and murdered Indigenous nations. It's genocide. It's a genocidal practice, just as the boarding schools were, just as Public Law 280 is, just like you look at federal laws down the line and you can see the reflection of the genocide and the colonization, and why we have all the disparities in tribal communities and Native communities that we do.
Thanks. Lucy?
Robin, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Paula. That is like the exact basis of why we cover what we do on this podcast, because it's all related and it's all connected. And you eloquently put it, historical connections are the reason why, we're having these discussions today. People tend to not know it or ignorant of, or they just ignore it. And so thank you so much for succinctly, very articulately pointing out this is exactly why we're doing what we're doing.
I would have to agree with that. Just coming from being in our communities, I feel like it's really easy for us to be in this bubble where we kind of just feel like, oh, this is just what's normal, or this is what's happening. And so when we hear you guys talk about it, like 3 steps back, at a national level, we also realize that, we're not the only ones that are impacted by this injustice. And for you to put that into perspective, as far as like the rates of federal prosecution goes, I'm like, I don't even know how to feel about that right now. Like I'm wrapping my head around that for a moment. Patsy, did you have anything you wanted to add really quickly before I go on to the next question?
Go ahead.
Okay. So with that history and insight, as advocates, what do you guys think we can do in the community to stay informed of policies that we need to pay attention to? So either whatever policies are current or ones that, we should really have a focus right now.
Sure. So there's several pieces of legislation that we're looking at, and I can talk about VAWA, and I'll leave it to Paula to talk about FIPSA as those 2 major pieces that are moving. So as advocates, it is really important to pay attention to the Violence Against Women Act. VAWA, as we know, is the nation's second federal law as of 1994, when it was passed by, one of the authors was President Biden. And it's important because, in it the bill is recognizing the violence against Native women, and that the federal government, again, has that responsibility to address, and that includes allocating federal resources and funding to tribes in assisting them in safeguarding the lives of Native women. And tribes have continued to receive resources since the beginning, back in 1995. With each reauthorization of VAWA in 2000, 2005, and 2013, Native women survivors, advocates, tribes, and organizations have really strengthened those different sections of VAWA that need to be indigenized, right? It's a process of, we're decolonizing, but indigenizing. So for example, in 2000, advocates really came together to secure funding for grassroots nonprofit tribal coalitions. So today we have over 19 tribal coalitions throughout the country, and they do have their own website, so we can provide that link or share that. And one of them is in Washington State, Women's Spirit Coalition, led by Dee Coaster. So in addition to getting that funding for tribal coalitions, later in 2003, the Native women delegates from coalitions used that funding to travel to New Zealand for an exchange with our Maori sisters, to see how our Maori sisters really organized themselves in response to violence against Maori women. So that exchange was really powerful, because then our tribal coalition sisters who traveled to New Zealand and had that exchange with our Maori sisters, they were really inspired by that exchange, and used that to move forward and partner with the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI, to really look at how they can impact and make those social changes, in response to like laws and policies that need to be looked at and changed. And so in one of the ways in which our coalitions and advocates really stepped up was, with the in our 2005 reauthorization of VAWA, which that's where Title IX, they breathed life into Title IX, which is the safety of Native women. So in that, there are in the Title IX VAWA 2005. There are 6 important findings and 3 purposes, again, that the advocates really should, when you have time to take a look at. The first four findings in VAWA refer to, critical findings, statistics, from federal reports regarding sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, and homicide among Native women. And these 6 congressional findings really stand as a strong national statement of the longstanding violence really endangering the lives of Native women. So those are really, really important. And it also further provided the justification for the actual creation of Title IX. Finding 5 asserted that tribes require additional criminal jurisdiction and the resources for Native women. And we really want to hone in too with finding 6 because finding 6 acknowledges that the U.S. has that federal trust responsibility to assist tribal governments in safeguarding the lives of Indian women. Again, we stress that because it's not the government telling tribes what to do, but it's assisting. So it's providing resources that tribes need so that tribes can then turn around and provide culturally appropriate, programs for our Native women and for the healing and other services that our Native women and families so desperately need. So we know that there's a need that remains outstanding. So again, that's part of, the advocates and the grassroots movement is to keep, testifying and providing testimony during tribal consultation about the resources that there's just not enough. So really, really important. And then finally, in terms of the purposes of the title, the purposes are important because, again, it's Congress showing that, they need to strengthen the capacity of Indian tribes to exercise their sovereign authority. Again, this is inherent, it's not given. That was a big fight for VAWA 2013. I think we all understand here, everybody on this podcast, that tribes have the inherent sovereign authority. So it's not given to us by the federal government, by the state government. We've always had it. So that's always important, and that was a huge lift for the VAWA 2013 fight. And for the purposes to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable for their criminal behavior. So again, we see so many perpetrators that travel to tribal lands because they know they can get away with crimes committed against Native women. One in Diane Millich is a person that I think of that she was married to a non-Native man, and he attempted to kill her on her reservation. And so again, it's these non-Indian perpetrators and other perpetrators that travel onto tribal lands to commit crimes because they know they can get away with it. So in VAWA, in terms of the reauthorization that we're looking at going forward, is the enhancing. It's enhancing these, making sure that tribes would also have jurisdiction over cases like child abuse, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking. So it's a big push, and where VAWA currently stands now, the House passed HR 1620 or 1620, the reauthorization of VAWA. VAWA actually expired or it was last reauthorized, in 2013 and expired in 2018, but was reintroduced. So again, the bill aims to, build on the historical victories that we had in 2013 VAWA, and to affirm, again, that inherent sovereign authority of Indian tribes in holding non-Indian perpetrators accountable. As of September, the Senate has yet to introduce its own VAWA bill, but they're possibly looking at October. So we're waiting for that language to to come down, is they haven't made it available yet. So so that's kind of where we stand in terms of VAWA. Paula, did you want to talk about FIPSA? I think you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so there are two federal laws that address violence against women. One was passed in 1984, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, or FIBSA. And the second was passed 10 years later, 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. And both of those bills, both of those laws have expired. Not to say that they're not still law, they still are. What's expired is the authorization for the money that's tied to both of those laws. That's what's expired. So the laws themselves continue to be the law of the US, but it's the dollar, it's the money that has expired in terms of authorization. Despite the expired authorizations, Congress, because of the loud outcry and voices of survivors, have actually increased the money in FIBSA since it expired. So FIBSA was last reauthorized in 2010. It expired in 2015. And from 2017 to today, we have seen over $20 million additional that Congress has set aside for tribes. That's unprecedented. We've never seen that in the history of FIBSA since its passage in 1984. And that's very much tied to voices like all of yours that speak out about the injustice happening locally and say that you need resources, you need authority, you need the federal government and state governments to respect your right to develop tribal specific responses to violence against women. And so both of those laws, again, we have two bills in the Senate and the House on FIBSA that have been introduced. Please go to our website to get the bill numbers. Please reach out to as many members of Congress as you can, particularly Republican members. Just to be frank, it's really been since 2010, since after 2010, that we began to see a more partisan response to violence against women. Up until 2010, we had bipartisan support, no question. But once we really started to dig deep and really look at reforms that were really meaningful for tribes and Native women, then we began to see really more of a Republican pushback on some of the reforms. FIBSA is dedicated funding for shelter and supportive services. And when we know what the stats are, that Native women experience the highest rates of domestic and sexual violence, yet across the country, there are less than 60 Native women's shelters and less than 300 tribal programs. Like, that's unacceptable. Like, what's wrong with that picture? We have the highest rates, but we have 60 shelters and less than 300 programs. And so we need everyone's help to reach out again to lawmakers, but particularly Republican lawmakers, to say, get this done, get this over the finish line, pass FIBSA and VAWA with the tribal enhancements that are there, because Native women need it. They don't need it in 10 years, they need it now.
Patsy?
Trying to get back here. Thank you, Rose and Paula, for just everything that you've shared. And as you were sharing, I couldn't help but think about the voices from the families and suggestions that you have for messaging. Should family members want to write a letter to Congress or write a letter to you, what are some key message points that families should really be sharing with you so that they could also begin using their voices as well about their own personal experiences and issues that they're facing today?
Rosa, did you want me to respond? Sorry. I think key messages, Patsy, would really be for families to share their stories. Those are the most impactful. we can talk statistics until we're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, what pushes things over the finish line are those stories. And that's what happened back in 2013, was the stories Diane Milich, Billy Joe, Lisa Bruner, Deb Parker, individual Native women stepping forward saying, if the laws were different, if my tribe had the resources, this would not have happened to me. And so families, have to share their stories. And share their stories in terms of how they've been impacted. If they've lost a loved one, what has that meant to their surviving family members? Because we know that it's the ripple effect, right? We can see the effects of MMIW for a few generations if there hasn't been healing work done and provided to those families. So 1, share their stories. 2, call for the passage of VAWA and SIBSA with the tribal enhancements that tribes and NCAI has endorsed since both SIBSA and VAWA have expired. We have NCAI resolutions on both of those bills. 3, I think the last thing is really for families to ask for a balance between reforming federal and state and local systems that are non-native and restoring indigenous protections. So I really want to what does that mean? So the Indian Law and Order Commission report from 2013 did a really great job of saying local tribal responses are the way to go. They are the most sustainable solution. If we continue to look to the federal, state, and local non-native governments for solutions, we'll be there forever. They will never be able to fully meet the needs of Native people in the same way that local Native solutions will. So it's really a balancing act. How do we make sure that changes in laws strengthen the federal, state, and local response, which is limited because, again, it's non-native, okay? But Indians deserve to be, they're U.S. citizens and they deserve to be protected like everybody else, no differential response. But they also deserve to have their indigenous protections available to them, which for too long has not been available. So, I would say that. I don't know if Rose has anything more to add.
No, I think you covered, I think, because that's sort of what I referenced in talking about VAWA was that personal story and how those, really brought it out. They breathed life into what they're speaking to, and people needed to hear their stories. And so that really had a huge impact. So I just agree with everything that Paula just shared.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share that as you were talking, Paula, it reminded me of a resolution that came before our general council regarding some of the issues we encounter within tribal government, but it's not unlike, the federal government, state government as well. They have similar types of issues. And the whole intent of the general council resolution was for program managers to be able to communicate with one another, within the organization, and to help make improvements by learning to communicate with one another within tribal government, and, thinking about ways that we could build strategies to make the needed improvements. And Paula, as you were talking about, the fact that, we know about the disparities, but if we know about the disparities, so the question is, what are we doing to address them as well? Part of that is our responsibility too. And for that reason, that's part of the reason that the podcast was started, was to help foster this communication and information for individuals and for families as well. So there's a lot of work to go around, a lot of work to be done. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, ladies.
Yeah, and I wonder if on that note, since we talked about historical violence and we're talking about present day cases and things that families can do and people in our communities can do with regards to being vocal or writing to our legislators. If we could bring up the one of your resources that talks about program development from the ground up, something about all of the inclusiveness, about the issues. As we move forward, program development must make consistent connections between the root cause of violence and the way programs do their work. Again, this is on niwrc.org. And I wonder if we can have both our team and our guests give some closing comments and that connects possibly to this or your other work.
So one of the things, again, thank you, Emily, for that comment, and just, thanking all of you, Robin, Lucy, Emily, Patricia, and my sister at NIWRC, Paula, for this podcast. We at NIWRC, we're very fortunate in that we have, we have a small but mighty staff. And as we continue to grow, we're seeing some transitions, and with our teams like the, training and TA team, who, really are a big part of going into tribal communities and, visiting with the tribes to see building from the ground up their local responses, like as mentioned with the ILOC report, the Indian Law and Order Commission report. It's the tribes who know and have the best knowledge in how to move forward with regards to addressing domestic violence and sexual assault, stalking, trafficking, murdered and missing. So they are best equipped to handle those large issues. We just, as advocates, need to continue to advocate for those resources, and we can stay connected in this work with, several avenues. One of them being Restoration Magazine. I know Patsy, as you all know, she carries that around and will share as we do as well. So might have to chip in for your medical bill for your back pain. Should you be you gotta carry those heavy restoration magazines, but that's definitely a way for advocates to to stay informed, and there's lots of ways to get engaged. So for example, the NCAI Violence Against Women Task Force meeting is coming up. That's next week. October 7th. So we can share registration. It's free of charge. I know Patricia and I know several other, like Abigail, definitely many tribal leaders from Washington and from across the country attend the NCAI task force meeting. So that's really an important way for advocates also to engage and to work with each other and to talk about the issues and then take it back locally, back home. These are ways that we can work as a community to address, these issues. And I know Yakima, also attends NCAI. So they have the morning caucus meetings that, you can also attend and be a part of. And I know that comes with the registration fee. But if you can, I know that the caucus meetings are also extremely important. And, Patricia is also a big part of that. And I always try to go to the Northwest or to that region and we'll provide updates about the work, because as we know, tribal leaders are really just, they're dealing with taxation, they're dealing with the pandemic, and they're dealing with a host of other issues. So it's really up to us, again, thinking of that responsibility that we have and how we can amplify our voices, collectively, and really raising these issues, talking about FIPSA and the importance of reauthorization, talking about VAWA reauthorization and all the tribal enhancements, VOCA fixes, and the Not Invisible Act, Savannah's Act. So there's just a number of ways to really move forward and, to have that connection. So, but I just, really want to thank you for again, very honored to be here.
Thank you. Others?
I would just add to that. You know, a part of our strategy as NIWRC, we have a three-pronged strategy. One is we have the political clarity of understanding. You know, as we talked about, the violence against women is tied to colonization and genocide. That's crystal clear. We don't need any research. That we know that. And we know that the path to safety is restoring that tribal sovereignty and strengthening those indigenous protections. So that's one. Two, it's important in terms of the tree that you showed, the tree graph that you showed. We do this work by centering indigenous worldview of Native women and indigenous worldview of Native peoples. So that's in terms of restoring indigenous protections. That's in the center. That's in the root, the trunk, and the leaves. Is very much about an indigenous tree. That, you know, culture is alive. Trees are alive. Culture is alive. So whatever that looks like, based on indigenous peoples, what their culture is today. Is, you know, we don't talk about going back to, you know, the 1800s, but we talk about remembering the teachings that you had about women, respecting women. So indigenous worldview is the second strategy. And then the third is the importance of grassroots organizing, that we are stronger together. You know, I think my tagline always when I post on social media is Strong Hearts United, Organizing for Change. You know, that's the spiritual part of the work, that responsibility, that we do this no matter what. We can have disagreements with each other. We don't have to like each other. It's about respecting those responsibilities and those beliefs and the strengths of the grassroots organizing. So like you all are doing through War Cry podcast, really organizing your people to be active and respond and engage with policymakers. Anything we can do to support you in that, please count us in. So thank you again so much for having us.
Thank you. And I just want to give a quick note about the website. So anything that was brought up here,
I think you froze, Robin.
I think she did.
Robin,
Well,
I'm gonna finish
while
your-
she's waiting to unfreeze, I also wanted to make a quick announcement that tomorrow, to kick off Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we'll be hosting a webinar, Tilly Black Bear Women Are Sacred Day. That's tomorrow from 12 to 1:30. So we encourage everybody to please join, to register. You can find that link on our website. And so we hope you'll join us tomorrow in really celebrating and honoring the legacy of Tilly, who, you know, we refer to as the grandmother of the movement. So so we hope you'll join us.
sorry about that. Yeah, I had my own technical difficulty that came out of nowhere.
We might have made you open so many windows and links, is what my guess. You were talking about just for people to be aware, the different links will be available on our social media. And is that what you were going to say, Robin?
Yes, and just how easy anything was to look up on their website. So you literally just put it in the search bar and it's there.
Great. And we also want to give a few war cries, of course, to National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, where you can find all their information on their website. And of course, their different trainings, one of which is tomorrow. Ncai, which is the National Congress of American Indians. It's the largest and oldest policy organization for tribes in the United States. I am a former Miss Ncai, if you didn't know that. I had to perfect my pageant wave. And I also want to, you know, as a lot of us are wearing orange today or acknowledging that and taking moments, give a war cry to the boarding school and residential school survivors and the families as they take in information, as they continue learning information, and as some of those bits and pieces of survivors come together. That's a very emotional process. And again, if at any point during this session or after you need culturally appropriate advocacy or support, please contact Strong Hearts Native Helpline at 1-844-7-NATIVE. Again, it's 1-844-762-8483, or you can chat online at strongheartshelpline.org. Again, we are an Indigenous-led podcast surviving under the duress of colonization and intergenerational trauma towards self-determination. I want to thank again, I'm Emily Washings. Thank you to co-hosts Robin Peebishy, Lucy Smartlowett, and Patricia Whitefoot. Thank you again to our War Cry podcast guests, Paula, Julian, and Rose Lee Quilt. We have some credits. We want to recognize that we are getting support from Native Women in Action. This is edited and produced by Robin Peebishy. Music by Lee Sekakwaptiwa. And logo and shirts by John Olney Schellenberger, where you can also get merch that supports our podcast at Native Anthro. Chef Patchai, and thank you very much.